For decades, people called Bigfoot encounters nothing more than tall tales and grainy hoaxes. But when cameras capture these creatures at their most terrifying and aggressive, the evidence becomes impossible to dismiss, and the nightmare is all too real. In today's episode, we reveal the most bone-chilling footage and encounters that will make you question everything you thought you knew about what's lurking in the darkness. A camera recorded Bigfoot doing something nobody believes when they see it. What began as a routine investigation turned into a clip of the Sasquatch doing the impossible. You're about to see proof that will make you believe that Bigfoot is real for the rest of your life. Stellan Vare had worked on investigative cases for 11 years. A timber called him 4 days after their bulldozer went missing from a contested logging site in the Six Rivers National Forest in Northern California. Not stolen, not broken down, but missing in the sense that pieces of it had been found in 3 separate locations and nobody could explain how they had gotten there or what had been strong enough to separate them from the rest of the machine. The first step was collecting the camera grid the logging crew had already installed. Before he even walked the terrain or studied topographic maps, Stellan drove the access roads and flagged each motion-activated trail camera the loggers had mounted around the worksite and along the road where the machine had last been confirmed operational. The company had placed them weeks earlier to document equipment activity and keep records during the dispute, which meant the cameras had been watching the area long before the bulldozer disappeared. Over the years, those cameras had captured bears wandering through cut blocks, vandals slipping past locked gates, poachers checking game trails, and the occasional lost hiker cutting through timber roads after dark. In 11 years of reviewing footage like that, they had never recorded anything that made Stellan sit in his truck and replay the same clip multiple times before he could bring himself to step outside. Camera 4 was positioned along the edge of a dense section of old-growth Douglas fir, mounted at chest height on a tree just off the service road that ran along the upper logging boundary. The footage was 1 minute and 39 seconds long. Stellan had watched it on the small screen of his laptop, parked at the edge of that same service road with the engine off and the afternoon light coming in flat through the windshield. How could less than 2 minutes of footage contain the answer to a mystery that had already scattered a bulldozer across the forest? The first seconds showed the road at the point where it curved past the tree line before opening into the staging area. The light was poor. A heavy overstory kept the ground mostly in shadow, with a few narrow shafts coming through at angles, shifting slightly as the branches moved in a high wind that couldn't quite reach the ground. For the first 2 seconds, there was nothing. Then something moved in the shadows between the trees, and Stellan felt his body go still in a way it did not usually go still. What kind of thing moves through a dark forest at that size and that speed and doesn't bother to stay in the shadows? A Sasquatch stepped into one of the narrow shafts of light, and the light was enough. It was upright. It was massive. Reddish-brown hair covered it from head to foot, dense and layered, the coat thickest across the shoulders and upper back, where it bunched and shifted with each stride. It moved with the kind of weight that you don't fake, not the performed heaviness of someone trying to walk large, but the deep structural weight of something that has never once in its life needed to consider what might be bigger than it. Every step compressed the road surface with a finality that had nothing theatrical in it. Stellan's first thought, embarrassingly, was that the camera had malfunctioned. Some trick of the lens, a compression artifact, something that would resolve into a bear or a downed tree if he just let it settle. His second thought arrived about a half-second later, when the full figure came into the light and the scale of it became undeniable, and that second thought had no words attached to it. His hands had gone still on the laptop keyboard. He was not aware of deciding to stop moving. He just had. If the footage wasn't a malfunction, then what exactly was Stellan watching walk across the same road he was parked beside? 8 feet tall, at minimum. He had done enough outdoor work, enough time measuring elk trails and bear markings against known reference points, to have a decent eye for height and scale, and he had never been far off. This was 8 feet, possibly a shade more, and he arrived at that number without having to think hard about it. The dead fur it passed at 11 seconds gave him his reference. The top of its head cleared a branch he could later measure at 7 feet 9 inches from the ground. The shoulders were the part that most resisted any effort to file it under something normal. A human being, even a very large one, has shoulders that fit inside a certain range, a range defined by the width of the skeleton beneath them, by the limits of what muscle can do to that frame. These did not fit inside that range. They were impossibly wide, rolling forward slightly with each stride in a way that suggested the whole upper body was built around a different set of proportions entirely. And the arms that hung from them were long in a way that had nothing to do with any human proportion Stellan had a reference for. They swung past the knees in a slow, heavy rhythm, each pendulum arc covering more distance than it should, the kind of rhythm that belongs to something that covers a lot of ground with very little effort, something that has never needed to hurry because hurrying has never been the point. If this forest was its territory, how long had it been watching the machines come through and tear it up? And how long had it been deciding what to do about them? Stellan watched it and noticed where it was going, the staging area. The bulldozer sat at the far edge of the service road where the crew had left it the previous evening, blade down, engine cold, sitting on the same packed gravel it had been sitting on when the operator signed off. The Sasquatch was walking directly toward it, with the same purposeful, unhurried gait it had held since the moment it entered the frame. There was no detour, no hesitation, no slowing to assess the open ground or the unfamiliar terrain of the cleared road. It was walking toward that machine the way a person walks toward something they have already made a decision about. The decision had been made somewhere else before the camera ever picked it up, and what was happening now was simply the execution. The gait was unhurried. That detail landed harder than the size. A Sasquatch that large, moving in the open, along a service road, and there was no urgency in it at all. No scan of the terrain, no checking of angles, none of the low-level alertness that wild animals carry through their bodies even at rest. Why would a wild creature move across an open road without even the smallest trace of caution? Wild animals are always, on some level, listening. Even the ones at the top of the food chain have something residual in them, some background process running beneath behavior, keeping a loose inventory of the environment. Bigfoot had none of that. It moved through the space the way you move through your own house in the dark, unhurried and unafraid, because every part of the space is already known. This was the pace of something that knew exactly where it was going and had no particular reason to rush. At 18 seconds, Bigfoot slowed, just slightly, and its head turned, not toward the camera, toward the staging area ahead, where the machine sat in the fading afternoon light at the edge of the cleared ground. It held that angle for about 2 seconds, then turned back and kept walking. The motion was so specific and so calm that Stellan watched it 3 times before he allowed himself to move on. Not assessment, not curiosity. It already knew the machine was there. The head turn was something else, the particular quality of attention you give to something you have been thinking about for a while and are now almost close enough to reach. Stellan had seen that quality in human subjects on surveillance footage. He had not expected to see it here. At 31 seconds, the service road passed under a gap in the canopy where a large tree had come down at some point, and the wider beam of light that came through that gap caught the hair across Bigfoot's shoulders in detail. Individual strands moved in a faint breeze, each at its own speed, the longer ones catching more air and moving further, the shorter ones barely shifting. It was the movement of real hair on a living body, not costume material, not anything synthetic, but actual biological material, each strand independent, responding to a small amount of air moving through the forest the way any animal's coat would respond to it. Stellan had worked enough wildlife cases to know what hair looked like on a large animal in natural light, and what he was seeing in those 2 seconds matched that in a way that he could not argue himself out of. It kept walking. The bulldozer was visible now at the far right margin of the camera's field. The wide blade, the upper cab structure, the bulk of the machine sitting exactly where the crew had left it. Bigfoot moved into the cleared staging ground, and the camera held its full profile. The cone-shaped skull, the heavy brow ridge above the flat face, the wide shoulders rolling forward in that consistent stride. It was still moving without any change of pace. It had not slowed. It had not stopped to evaluate. Whatever it intended to do when it reached that machine, the decision was already behind it, made and settled somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, not something it was still working out as it crossed the open ground. If the decision had already been made hours earlier, what had convinced it that the bulldozer needed to be dealt with? At 45 seconds, Bigfoot stopped. The stop was total, not a slow deceleration, not a shift of weight, but an immediate halt, the way a body stops when it has arrived at the thing it came for. It was standing at the front of the bulldozer. The machine came up to roughly its mid-chest. Stellan had the dimensions of a bulldozer memorized from the case file. Operating weight around 20,000 pounds. Blade width 14 feet. Cab height just under 10 feet to the exhaust stack. He held those numbers in his head and looked at the Sasquatch standing in front of it and felt something happen in the back of his mind that was not comfortable. Then the head turned, not toward the machine, toward the camera. It found the lens with the same precision it had found its destination, directly, without a search, without the half-second of scanning that would have been present if it hadn't already known where to look. Bigfoot's eyes found the lens and held it. How long had it known the camera was there before it decided to look at it? The expression on the face was not what he would have expected. There was no startle in it, no alarm, none of the wide-eye tension that comes through clearly on any large mammal when it encounters something unexpected. The expression was flat, unreadable in the specific way that a face becomes unreadable when the emotion behind it is something unfamiliar. Not the absence of expression, but an expression that had no match in anything Stellan knew how to read. If the creature wasn't surprised by the camera or the machine, then what exactly had it come here expecting to find? If he had to name it, and he resisted doing so, he would have called it acknowledgement. The eye contact lasted 3 seconds. Midway through those 3 seconds, there was a small movement in the irises, a slight shift in the direction of gaze, not dramatic, not a full look away, but the micro-movement that happens when a brain is actively working behind the eyes. Bigfoot was not staring, not frozen, but processing the camera with the same deliberate efficiency it had applied to everything else in its path. Whatever the camera represented, the evaluation was brief. It had been located, classified, and deprioritized in the span of 3 seconds, and then it was simply no longer the focus. That kind of response, finding a thing, deciding about it, continuing, is not the behavior of instinct. Instinct is louder and less precise. What happened at 45 seconds was a decision. After 3 seconds, Bigfoot turned back to the machine. Stellan stayed on the frame, the moment just after the eye contact ended and the Sasquatch turned its attention back to the bulldozer. For a long time, the way you stay on a frame when some part of you is hoping the pause will give the image somewhere else to go. He had reviewed hundreds of hours of trail camera footage over 11 years. He had seen wildlife, vandals, trespassers, livestock. He had a working vocabulary for what human damage looked like and what animal damage looked like and where the boundary between them sat. He had never once, in 11 years, expected to need a category on the other side of both of those things at once. If the answer to the bulldozer damage didn't fit human behavior or animal behavior, what exactly had Stellan been hired to investigate? At 59 seconds, it started. Bigfoot placed both hands against the front blade of the dozer. Not a strike, a placement, deliberate and measured, with the flat of both palms against the upper edge of the steel, fingers curling slightly over the lip. There was no wind-up. There was no gathering of effort, no widening of the stance, no visible bracing. The body didn't shift. It just applied force, and the blade moved. Stellan watched it and thought about the numbers. To move something that heavy from a standing position with no leverage, no running start, no equipment of any kind, through the application of hand pressure alone, he could not finish the calculation in a way that came out as possible. He watched it happen on the screen anyway. The machine rocked backward. Not dramatically, not a catastrophic lurch, A single, authoritative rock, the tracks on the far side lifting a few inches off the ground before the weight came back down. The settling impact when it came back down was audible on the microphone. Bigfoot had not moved. Its feet were in the same position. Its posture was the same. It had pushed 20,000 pounds backward a measurable distance without leaning into it, and whatever that had cost it was not visible anywhere on its body. Then it gripped the blade and pulled. The sound the microphone captured at 1 minute and 4 seconds was not a sound Stellan had a reference for. It was metal under stress, the particular dense, tearing quality of structural steel separating at points it was not designed to separate at, layered over a lower, sustained groan that was the frame of the machine responding to a force it had not been engineered to withstand. If the frame of the bulldozer was already failing under the strain, how much more of it could the creature take apart? The blade came away in 2 pieces. The first piece went somewhere to the left, out of frame. The second piece the Sasquatch held in one hand, examined briefly in the way you examine a thing that has just come apart in a manner that surprises you slightly, and then set down on the ground beside the machine with a precision that was almost careful. He replayed those 4 seconds 6 times. What he was looking for, what part of his brain kept insisting had to be there, was some visible exertion in the body, some shift of the hips, some drop of the shoulder, some change of breath visible in the chest or the ribcage. In any large animal under load, you can read the effort. The spine curves toward the resistance. The legs drive into the ground. Something moves that tells you the body is working against something that requires working against. None of that was present. The Sasquatch had removed a steel blade from a 20,000-pound dozer, and the only thing that changed in its body was the position of its arms. Stellan had no explanation for that. He had no framework that could hold it. He just watched it again, and the footage kept showing him the same thing it had shown him every previous time. If the evidence refused to change no matter how many times he replayed it, how was he supposed to explain it to the people who had hired him? He looked at the paused frame on his laptop screen, the machine with its blade gone, the Sasquatch standing beside it with what had been solid welded structural steel lying in 2 pieces in the gravel, and thought about every equipment damage case he had worked that ended with a clear explanation, and how none of them had pointed anywhere near here. Most equipment damage in wilderness had one of 4 causes: vandalism, weather, mechanical failure, or transportation accident. He had never once, in 11 years, needed a 5th category. He sat in the truck for probably 2 minutes without moving, and then he started the clip again. Bigfoot moved down the left side of the machine. The same unhurried gait, the same absence of urgency, walking the length of the dozer the way a person walks the length of something they are inspecting and taking inventory of. At the track assembly, it stopped and crouched, and Stellan lost the upper body to the camera angle, and then there was a sound like a rifle shot, and the camera image shook from the vibration of it, and when the Sasquatch stood back up and kept walking, it was carrying a section of track chain that weighed, by Stellan's later estimate, somewhere between 400 and 500 pounds. It carried it one-handed, the chain hanging in a loose loop from its fist, swinging slightly with each stride in the way things swing when they are being carried by something that does not find their weight particularly notable. It stood at the far end of the machine and held still. It had done something deliberate, and now it was simply standing with the chain at its side, upright and without any shift of weight, in the specific stillness that is different from rest. Not the stillness of something that has stopped because it is tired. The stillness of something that has stopped because it is done with one part and is now considering the next. If this was only one step in a process, what part of the machine would it decide to remove next? The force required to produce what the microphone had captured was not something he could talk himself past. He had worked enough outdoor cases to have a working understanding of what a large body in motion sounds like when it connects with a solid surface, when it bends steel, when it removes load-bearing components from machinery designed to operate in the harshest available terrain. What he had heard from 1 minute and 4 seconds onward was not close to anything a human being was capable of producing without cutting equipment, without time, without preparation of any kind. The effort simply did not register on the Sasquatch's body. Nothing changed in its face. Nothing changed in its posture. It had torn the blade off a 20,000-pound machine and removed a section of track assembly and was now holding 500 pounds of chain in one fist, with the same affect as someone holding a set of car keys. It swung what it had removed as if this required roughly the same amount of attention as opening a door, and then it stood and looked at the rest of the machine, and the expression on its face was the particular blankness of something that is deciding what comes next. If removing a bulldozer blade registered the same way opening a door did, what would actually constitute effort for something like this? The waiting was the part that resisted any clean explanation. This was not random destruction. It was not territorial aggression in any documented form. It was not feeding behavior. It was something that looked, from the outside, like work. A job being done with professional composure by something that knew exactly what it was doing and had no need to rush through it. Bigfoot had arrived at a specific machine and was working through it with the methodical attention of something that had a clear idea of what it wanted the end state to look like. All of that had the shape of intention, of a plan formed somewhere else in the dark and the quiet of this forest, and now simply being executed one component at a time with no wasted motion and no visible exertion. Stellan had been on enough investigative calls to know the difference between damage caused by force and damage caused by intention. Force leaves patterns that are directional and predictable. The vectors of an impact, the trajectory of a slide, the failure points of metal stressed beyond its rating. Intention leaves patterns that are selective. A machine stripped of specific components, left in a specific condition, arranged in a way that suggests the end state was the objective from the beginning. What Camera 4 had captured had the shape of intention, from the moment the Sasquatch placed its palms against the blade to the moment it stood with the track chain in its fist. And it was the most unsettling thing Stellan had encountered in 11 years of work that occasionally turned up unsettling things. He thought about that while he watched the clip a second time. The components had been removed in a sequence that made a kind of structural sense. The blade first, which bore the weight of the forward end. The track section next, which compromised the machine's mobility. If you wanted to disable a bulldozer permanently, if you wanted to render it irreparable rather than merely inoperative, that was roughly the order in which a knowledgeable person would work. He did not know what to do with the implication of that. He set it to the side and kept watching. If the sequence mirrored how a trained operator would disable a machine, how did the Sasquatch know where to start? At 1 minute and 14 seconds, the tree line on the far side of the staging area moved. Not the way wind moves a tree line, not a general wave-like shift of branches and upper canopy. The movement was low and specific, the kind that comes from a large body pushing through dense brush, and it happened at a single point in the tree line directly across the staging area from where Bigfoot stood. A second Sasquatch stepped out. Stellan's first impression was size, and his second impression was that his first impression had been wrong because he had used the first Bigfoot as his baseline for large. The second Sasquatch was bigger, noticeably, significantly bigger. He estimated somewhere between 9.5 and 10 feet, broader across the chest and shoulders, the coat darker, almost black in the shadows at the edge of the staging area, and shifting toward a very deep brown, only when it moved far enough into the light. Each step carried a mass that was visible in the way the ground responded, in the way the gravel compressed and shifted with each footfall. If the first one had already dismantled part of the machine alone, what could the larger one do when it reached it? It moved directly to the dozer cab. No inspection, no pause. It gripped the cab structure at the roofline with both hands, and what it did next happened in the same quiet, businesslike way everything had happened since the first Bigfoot walked into frame. The cab came off the frame, not twisted, not folded, separated cleanly at the mounting points, lifted away from the machine as a unit, and set down on the far side of the clearing with the same considered placement the first Sasquatch had used when it set down the blade section. The roll cage was still intact, the seat was still inside it. The whole assembly sat upright on the gravel, and the machine beneath it was open to the sky. its internal workings exposed to the forest air, as if the cab had simply been removed for maintenance by someone who knew exactly which bolts to pull. The two Sasquatches stood in the staging area and faced what remained of the dozer. There was no sound between them on the microphone, no vocalization, no clicking, no signal of any kind. They stood in the remaining light with the stripped machine between them, and they were still, and whatever was happening between them did not require sound. If they weren't communicating out loud, how had they coordinated the work so precisely? Then the larger one looked up. It found the camera immediately. The head came up, and the eyes went directly to the lens without a scan, without a search, without the delay that would have been present if it didn't already know where to look. It held eye contact for 3 seconds, the same duration as the first Sasquatch, and the expression Stellan saw on its face across that brief span of footage was not curiosity. It was not alarm. It was something that he kept turning over in his mind on the drive back south and could not find a better word for than acknowledgement. Not surprise that the camera was there, not aggression toward it. Something closer to the look a person gives when they notice they are being watched and want you to know they noticed. The clip ended. 99 seconds of footage, and Stellan had no idea what to do with any of it. If the creatures knew they were being watched, had the camera captured exactly what they wanted someone to see? The Halverson equipment had been at that site for 3 weeks. Whatever had been decided about it had been decided somewhere in that window, in the old-growth forest above the staging area, in the dark, with no documentation of any kind, no record of the deliberation, no way to read the outcome, until Camera 4 picked up the result in 1 minute and 39 seconds of footage. This was not a territorial behavior that happened to be caught on camera. It was a territorial behavior that was delivered to one. They had not been surprised by his equipment. They had used it. The destruction was not something that Stellan's investigation had uncovered. It was something that had been staged for his investigation, or for whoever came after him, or for the footage to eventually reach whoever at the Halverson Timber Company had the authority to decide whether the machines went back in. On June 5, 2015, a camera captured Bigfoot doing something nobody has witnessed before. What started as one guy's mission to prove these creatures exist became a clip of Bigfoot doing the extraordinary. You're about to see evidence that will change everything you believe about the Sasquatch for the rest of your life. Marcus Chen had one goal that took over his entire life: getting perfect footage of Bigfoot. At 31, this guy from Portland had spent the last 5 years putting every free moment and every dollar he had into this one mission. While other wildlife photographers were out filming deer and bears, Chen was hunting for something way more amazing and way harder to find. To most people, he was crazy, but everything changed on June 5, 2015, when his camera captured something that would make even the biggest skeptics question what they thought they knew about these creatures. Chen's strategy was simple. Instead of trying to chase these creatures through the forest like everyone else did, he would let them come to him. Motion-activated cameras set up in the right spots could record for weeks, capturing natural behavior that no human could ever see. If Bigfoot was as smart as Chen thought, the creatures would eventually check out his equipment, and that investigation would be recorded in perfect detail. But Chen had no idea his cameras would capture behavior so advanced it would redefine what intelligence means in the animal kingdom. The breakthrough came when Chen studied sighting patterns in a Washington forest. Multiple people had reported seeing Bigfoot in the same area over 15 years, which meant either one creature lived there or a whole family considered this place their home. Even better, the sightings all happened around natural paths that would force any big creature to follow predictable routes. Chen spent months getting ready for what he knew would be his best shot at capturing real Bigfoot footage. He bought military-grade motion cameras with night vision, weatherproof cases that could handle anything, and memory storage that could record for a whole month. He was betting everything on this one trip, never imagining his cameras would document something that would challenge the very definition of what these creatures are capable of. On June 3, 2015, Chen finished setting up his most promising camera spot, what he called Position 7. He spent hours getting the camera angle and motion sensors perfect at that spot. But as Chen worked on his camera setup, he noticed signs that made his heart race. Fresh scratches on nearby trees were too high and too big to have been made by any known animal. The claw marks were about 12 inches long and carved deep into bark 8 feet off the ground. Exactly the kind of sign that Bigfoot researchers dream of finding. Even more exciting was the constant feeling of being watched while working. Years of being alone in the wilderness had taught him to trust these feelings, and something about Position 7 felt different. Chen had the strong impression that his work was being observed by something smart enough to stay hidden while studying what he was doing. Little did he know that intelligence was far more advanced than he could have ever imagined. Chen's final notes from June 3rd showed he was cautiously optimistic, but trying not to get his hopes up too high. The signs looked promising, but he'd been disappointed before by locations that seemed perfect, but only recorded footage of regular forest animals. Still, something about Position 7 felt special. If Bigfoot were going to show up anywhere, it would be here. Chen left the forest on June 4th with a mix of excitement and nervousness that would bug him for the next 3 weeks. His cameras were recording continuously, potentially capturing the footage that would prove Bigfoot exists to the whole world. But Chen had learned not to expect too much. Disappointment was the most common result in Bigfoot research. What Chen didn't know was that his cameras were about to record something that would be way more amazing than anything he had ever imagined possible. The footage would show intelligence so advanced that it would force scientists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about non-human consciousness. At 3:47 a.m. on June 5th, less than 2 days after Chen had left the forest, his motion camera at Position 7 detected the movement he had been hoping for his entire adult life. The night vision sensors turned on as something huge approached the camera, taking deliberate, purposeful steps that were totally different from normal wildlife activity. What came out of the forest darkness was exactly what Chen had spent 5 years trying to capture: a real Bigfoot moving through its natural habitat with no idea that humans were watching. The creature stood about 7.5 feet tall, with a human-like posture and physical features clearly not human. Bigfoot's first appearance in Chen's footage was everything he had dreamed of and more. Dark brown hair covered the creature's massive body, with gray patches around the face and shoulders that suggested an older, experienced individual. The creature moved smoothly and confidently, showing none of the nervousness you'd expect from an animal in unfamiliar territory. But what happened next would begin a sequence of events that would build towards something absolutely mind-blowing. Instead of just passing through the area as Chen expected, the creature stopped and started examining his camera equipment with obvious curiosity and intelligence that challenged everything people thought they knew about animal behavior. Bigfoot's approach to Chen's camera demonstrated abilities and awareness beyond anything documented in previous Bigfoot research. The creature walked around the camera position for almost 3 minutes, studying the equipment from multiple angles with the careful attention of a scientist examining something they'd never seen before. But this was just the beginning of behavior that would culminate in something truly extraordinary. Chen's night vision footage captured details about Bigfoot that no previous researcher had ever recorded. The creature's hands were clearly visible as it moved closer to the camera. 5 distinct fingers, including a thumb with proportions about twice the size of human hands, but showing similar skill and range of motion. At 3:52 a.m., Bigfoot made direct physical contact with Chen's camera equipment in a way that would completely change the understanding of how smart these creatures are. Instead of touching the device randomly or trying to break it, Bigfoot examined the camera with deliberate precision, suggesting it understood what the technology was for. The creature's handling of Chen's equipment showed problem-solving abilities and mechanical understanding that challenged the very definition of animal intelligence. Bigfoot touched the lens housing gently, traced mounting hardware with careful finger movements, and studied the blinking recording light with obvious understanding of what it meant. Yet this display of intelligence was merely setting the stage for what would come later. For the next 8 minutes and 12 seconds, Chen's camera recorded behavior that mainstream science would say was impossible. Bigfoot crouched directly in front of the lens, bringing its face within 3 feet of the recording equipment, and examined the device with careful attention, revealing remarkable intelligence. The most incredible part of this examination was that Bigfoot seemed to understand what the camera did. The creature's attention was focused on the lens and recording indicators, suggesting it knew the device was capturing its image and behavior. This tech awareness led to behavior that went way beyond animal curiosity and showed abstract thinking that would soon manifest in ways that would blow your mind. At 3:58 a.m., Bigfoot demonstrated intelligence that would challenge every scientific assumption about what these creatures could do. After examining the camera from multiple angles, the creature reached behind the device and carefully adjusted the tripod mounting system with precision that required an understanding of how mechanical systems work and of spatial relationships. The tripod adjustment was deliberate and exact. The creature moved Chen's camera 15 degrees to the left, creating a better viewing angle of the forest clearing. This change required Bigfoot to understand the relationship between camera position and what it could record, demonstrate mechanical knowledge of how tripod systems work, and use precise motor control to achieve the desired result. But Bigfoot's tech interaction was only the beginning of behavior that would build towards something that would redefine the understanding of how smart these creatures are. After finishing the camera adjustment, the creature stepped back and looked at its work with obvious satisfaction, tilting its head to study the new recording angle with aesthetic judgment that suggested sophisticated mental processing. The creature's satisfaction with its camera modification led to behavior that set this encounter apart from any previous Bigfoot documentation. Instead of leaving after its tech interaction, Bigfoot turned away from the camera and disappeared into the forest for several minutes, leaving Chen's equipment recording an empty clearing with the improved view the creature had deliberately created. But Bigfoot wasn't done. What it would do next would demonstrate intelligence that approaches human-level thinking. At 4:06 a.m., Bigfoot returned carrying something that would transform this encounter from remarkable to extraordinary. The creature came out of the forest with a large river stone, smooth, oval-shaped, about the size of a grapefruit, that it had obviously picked from a location outside the camera's recording range. Bigfoot's return with the stone showed planning and intentional behavior that challenged the very definition of what animals could do. The creature had left the camera position with clear purpose, found a specific object that met particular requirements, and returned to carry out a plan that suggested abstract thinking and creative expression. What followed was behavior that would revolutionize understanding of Bigfoot intelligence and artistic ability. The creature carried the stone to a position directly in front of Chen's camera lens, placing it carefully within the adjusted recording frame with movements that were precise and deliberate. The stone placement revealed thinking abilities that mainstream science refuses to believe exist outside human intelligence. After positioning the stone in the center of the camera frame, Bigfoot stepped back and studied the visual composition from the camera's perspective, evaluating the arrangement with aesthetic judgment that suggested artistic ability. The creature wasn't satisfied with its first placement. After studying the composition, Bigfoot returned to make a small adjustment, moving the stone slightly to the left to achieve better visual balance within the recording frame. This compositional refinement showed understanding of aesthetic principles and visual design that approached artistic expression. With the stone placement completed, Bigfoot stepped back to its full impressive height and looked directly into Chen's camera for 3 full seconds. The creature's expression during this direct eye contact was unmistakable. Awareness, intelligence, and conscious acknowledgement of the recording process that proved these beings understand technology and its purpose. After its direct camera acknowledgement, Bigfoot turned and walked back into the forest with the same smooth motion that had characterized its approach. Within moments, the creature vanished into the darkness, leaving only the carefully placed stone as evidence that this extraordinary encounter had happened. But this was just the first part of an exchange that would culminate in something absolutely unbelievable. Chen's camera continued recording throughout the rest of the night, but the forest remained empty except for the stone that sat in perfect visual composition within the frame the creature had deliberately adjusted. Bigfoot had turned Chen's research equipment into interactive communication technology. When Chen discovered this footage during a preliminary equipment check on June 7th, he realized he had captured something that was way beyond his wildest dreams. But the documentary filmmaker's scientific training told him this could be an attempt at communication, and his Bigfoot research instincts demanded that he test this theory through controlled experimentation. What he was about to discover would challenge everything science believes about these creatures. Chen made a decision that would extend this encounter into unprecedented territory. He would respond to Bigfoot's stone placement with his own offering and see if the creature would engage in further interaction. This was the opportunity every Bigfoot researcher dreamed of, the chance to establish communication with these elusive beings. But Chen had no idea he was about to witness something that would redefine what it means to be intelligent. Chen returned to position 7 carrying a small cloth bag filled with mixed nuts and dried fruit. Trail mix that represented a clear human offering that couldn't be mistaken for natural forest objects. His plan was to replace Bigfoot's stone with his own gift and document whether the creature would respond with continued interaction. But Chen's experimental design went beyond simple object exchange. He installed a second motion-activated camera at a hidden position 200 yards from his primary recording location. This backup camera would provide secondary documentation of any Bigfoot activity while remaining concealed from the creature's obvious awareness of his primary equipment. The dual camera setup reflected Chen's understanding that he was potentially documenting behavior that would be dismissed by mainstream science unless supported by multiple sources of evidence. If Bigfoot returned and showed further intelligent behavior, Chen wanted rock-solid proof that could withstand inevitable skepticism. He had no idea he was about to capture something that would make skepticism impossible. Chen completed his experimental setup on the afternoon of June 7th and left the forest with anticipation that bordered on obsession. His entire adult life had been leading to this moment, the possibility of establishing communication with Bigfoot and proving these creatures had intelligence that science refused to acknowledge. The answer to Chen's experiment came at 11:34 p.m. on June 8th, when both cameras detected movement approaching position 7. Bigfoot's return was captured from multiple angles as the creature approached Chen's modified setup with obvious awareness of both recording devices. What was about to unfold would demonstrate intelligence so advanced it would challenge the very definition of consciousness. Bigfoot's detection of Chen's dual camera system showed observational abilities that exceeded anything in previous Bigfoot research. The creature's approach path and body positioning showed clear recognition of both recording devices, suggesting environmental awareness that allowed it to detect hidden technology specifically designed to avoid animal detection. But Bigfoot's tech awareness was surpassed by its response to Chen's trail mix offering. The creature approached the bag with immediate recognition that the object represented intentional communication from the human who had installed the recording equipment. This wasn't cautious animal curiosity. This was intelligent recognition of deliberate interaction. Bigfoot's handling of Chen's offering showed fine motor control and sensory sophistication that challenged every assumption about what these creatures could do. The bag was examined through touch and smell with deliberate precision, the creature's massive hands manipulating the fabric and contents with skill that rivaled human manipulation. Chen's backup camera captured what happened next from a perfect angle that revealed details invisible in the primary footage. After examining the trail mix bag thoroughly, Bigfoot sat down cross-legged directly in front of Chen's primary camera and proceeded to eat the offered food, with behavior that was remarkably human-like in its precision and social awareness. But this was just the prelude to something truly extraordinary. For 6 minutes and 43 seconds, both cameras documented a Bigfoot engaging in controlled eating behavior that showed intelligence, manual dexterity, and social sophistication that mainstream science insists cannot exist outside human species. The creature opened Chen's trail mix bag carefully to avoid tearing the material, then picked through the contents with obvious selectivity and preference. Bigfoot's food selection revealed thinking abilities that went far beyond simple hunger satisfaction. The creature ate cashews and dried cranberries while throwing almonds onto the ground, beside where it was sitting. This selective behavior suggested taste preferences and decision-making processes that indicated sophisticated mental processing. But the most remarkable aspect of Bigfoot's eating behavior was its obvious awareness of being recorded. Between bites, the creature glanced directly at Chen's primary camera with acknowledgement that was clearly deliberate rather than coincidental. Bigfoot was performing for the camera while maintaining conscious awareness of its audience. Yet even this incredible display was building towards something that would leave you speechless. When Bigfoot finished eating Chen's trail mix, its behavior moved into territory that went beyond animal response and entered the realm of abstract communication. Instead of dropping the empty bag or leaving it scattered, the creature carefully folded the packaging material with precise finger movements that created a neat, compact rectangle. The bag folding showed respect for Chen's offering and understanding of reciprocal social obligations that suggested these creatures operate according to complex social rules. Bigfoot wasn't simply eating offered food, it was participating in a structured exchange that acknowledged the communication attempt. But what came next would demonstrate intelligence that approaches human-level consciousness. Bigfoot's response to Chen's offering exceeded every expectation and challenged every assumption about what these creatures could do. After folding the empty trail mix bag and setting it aside, Bigfoot reached behind its back and produced something it had apparently been carrying throughout its approach to the camera position. What the creature revealed was 5 pine cones bound together with twisted grapevines in an arrangement that was clearly artificial and obviously intentional. The pine cone bundle represented deliberate craft production that required planning, material selection, and manual construction techniques that indicated sophisticated thinking abilities. The pine cone bundle's construction suggested abstract thinking that went far beyond simple tool use into territory that approached artistic expression and symbolic communication. Bigfoot had selected specific pine cones based on size and shape requirements, found appropriate binding material, and constructed an aesthetically pleasing arrangement that served no practical purpose beyond communication. The creature's presentation of its pine cone creation showed understanding of reciprocity principles and social exchange that challenged the very definition of intelligence as applied to non-human species. This was conscious participation in structured communication that acknowledged Chen's offering and provided an appropriate response. Bigfoot's placement of its pine cone bundle revealed the same compositional awareness and aesthetic judgment that had characterized its initial stone placement. The creature positioned the bundle precisely in the center of Chen's camera frame, ensuring optimal visibility and visual balance within the recording perspective. After completing its gift placement, Bigfoot repeated the direct camera acknowledgement that had concluded its initial encounter. The creature stood to its full impressive height and looked directly into both of Chen's cameras in sequence, turning its head deliberately to acknowledge each recording device individually. But what happened next would be the moment that changes everything. Bigfoot's direct eye contact with Chen's cameras lasted 3 full seconds for each device, a duration that was clearly intentional rather than coincidental. During this eye contact, the creature's expression conveyed awareness, understanding, and conscious communication with the human intelligence that would eventually view this footage. But the final moment of Chen's extraordinary documentation provided evidence that would challenge every scientific assumption about Bigfoot intelligence and communication ability. As the creature concluded its direct camera acknowledgement and prepared to leave, it did something that no animal has ever been documented doing. Something that would prove these beings possess intelligence that rivals our own. Bigfoot raised one massive hand toward Chen's primary camera. But this wasn't just any gesture. The creature deliberately formed what could only be described as a wave. The hand moved in a clear, unmistakable waving motion that lasted about 2 seconds and showed absolutely clear intention rather than random movement. This was the moment that would change everything. Bigfoot had just waved goodbye to the camera, a deliberate, conscious farewell gesture that indicated not just intelligence, but understanding of human social conventions and the desire to communicate using recognizable human gestures. The implications were staggering. This creature understood it was being recorded, knew a human would eventually watch this footage, and chose to communicate directly with that future human observer using a universally recognized gesture of acknowledgement and farewell. After its farewell wave, Bigfoot turned and walked back into the forest with the same smooth motion that had characterized its approach. Within moments, the creature vanished completely into the darkness, leaving only its pine cone bundle as evidence that this remarkable exchange had occurred. When Chen retrieved his cameras on June 24th and reviewed the complete footage for the first time, he realized he had accomplished something that no Bigfoot researcher had ever achieved. He had not only captured clear, undeniable footage of these creatures, he had documented intelligence, technological understanding, and communication abilities that challenged the fundamental assumptions of modern science. The wave changed everything. It proved that Bigfoot doesn't just possess intelligence. These creatures understand human communication, recognize technology, and actively choose to interact with us when they feel safe to do so. Chen's footage represents the first documented evidence of a Bigfoot deliberately communicating with humans, using recognizable gestures, forever changing what we know about these remarkable beings. Marcus Chen had achieved his life's goal of capturing Bigfoot on camera, but what he discovered was far more extraordinary than he had ever imagined possible. What was just uncovered has left even the world's most skeptical experts speechless, and some of them are refusing to talk about it. What you're about to see is so undeniable, scientists are calling it the most convincing Bigfoot evidence ever recorded in human history. The Bigfoot evidence started with a dent, not a dramatic one, nothing torn from its hinges or crushed inward with the kind of obvious violence that commands immediate attention. Just a subtle crease along the edge of a steel access panel at a remote ridge facility, noted in a maintenance log on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday in late autumn. Weather damage, most likely. The kind of entry that gets written in the shorthand of mild inconvenience and filed without ceremony, destined to be read by no one and forgotten by morning. The facility itself was the sort of place that didn't invite curiosity. Situated on a forested ridge, accessible only by a single unpaved service road, it had been operational for decades in the quiet, bureaucratic way of infrastructure that exists to serve a function rather than to be noticed. The people who worked there rotated in and out on scheduled shifts, performed their tasks, logged their observations, and drove back down the mountain. It was not the kind of posting that attracted people who asked too many questions. The following day, another maintenance entry appeared. Same panel and same edge. A small bend, nearly identical to the first. Once more, the on-site team shrugged. Metal expands in heat and contracts in cold. A year of weather cycles along a ridge exposed to significant wind loading will work on even heavy-gauge steel. The site engineer added a note about scheduling a repair assessment and turned his attention to other things. A week later, the photographs arrived at headquarters, fresh marks on an adjacent panel, the damage slightly more pronounced this time, the pressure impressions along the lower edge of the deformation a little deeper, a little cleaner. The facilities manager who reviewed the images spent perhaps 90 seconds looking at them before forwarding them to the maintenance queue with a brief note about monitoring the situation. But the Bigfoot marks didn't monitor themselves back into normalcy. They kept appearing. Why would the marks persist if there was no observer or intent behind them? It was only when a junior analyst tasked with compiling a quarterly maintenance summary had the idea to arrange the photographs chronologically, weeks of them, then months, that the dismissals began to feel less comfortable. The images had been reviewed individually, each assessed against the specific context of its logging date. each measured against the narrow question of whether it represented an immediately actionable problem. Seen that way, each one was unremarkable, but laid side by side in sequence, they told a different story entirely. The deformations weren't random. They weren't scattered across the panels the way that weather damage scatters, asymmetrically, following the path of wind and water and thermal expansion. They were clustering, always at the same height, 7 feet, 8 inches above the ground. The analyst noticed this first and made a note of it, uncertain what to make of it, but unwilling to dismiss it. The site engineer, shown the compiled photographs for the first time as a sequence rather than as isolated incidents, went quiet in a way that his colleagues found difficult to interpret. Along the lower edge of each damaged panel, there were narrow pressure impressions, spaced and curved in a way that was unmistakably regular, unmistakably intentional. A structural analysis firm was brought in during the 4th month. Their report used careful language, the language of professionals who understand that conclusions have consequences. But the core finding was unambiguous. The metal had been gripped. The force applied exceeded anything within human physical capability by a significant margin, and the upward scoring across each panel, shallow grooves running from bottom to top, consistent and parallel, did not suggest vandalism or an animal pressing against a surface in confusion. It suggested something trying, deliberately and repeatedly, to find purchase, to pull upward, to open the door. What kind of creature grips reinforced steel with enough force to bend it? And why does it keep returning again and again to the same door? The team documented it carefully. They wrote their reports in the passive voice that institutional documentation favors, the grammatical construction that describes events without assigning agents. The panel was deformed, force was applied, and gripping was indicated. They gathered in the small break room at the end of shifts and spoke about other things, because speaking about this thing required a vocabulary that none of them had yet developed. They didn't need to develop it. The next piece of Bigfoot evidence arrived before anyone had time to process the first. The first significant rainfall of the season came in early November. 3 days of steady downpour that softened the clay-heavy soil of the service road into the kind of medium that preserves impressions the way wax preserves a seal. The team noticed the tracks on the morning of the 4th day when the rain had stopped and the ground had set enough to hold its shape without collapsing. 17 inches long. No claw marks, no boot heel, no pad structure consistent with any large carnivore native to the region, no bear, no mountain lion, nothing that appeared in any wildlife database the investigators later consulted. Just clean, deep impressions in the reddish mud, the footprint of something that walked fully upright, with an arch that was flexible in the way that only an unshod primate foot is flexible. Its weight transferring smoothly, unhurriedly, from heel to forefoot in a rolling gait that spoke of comfort rather than effort. The impressions were sunk deep, not the shallow depressions of a light-footed animal, but the confident, ground-compressing marks of something very heavy moving without the slightest concern about being noticed. Biomechanical modeling of the stride length and ground pressure, conducted by a university laboratory whose researchers were told only that the samples came from an unknown large animal, returned an estimated body weight of between 700 and 900 pounds. The lead researcher, upon receiving the track casts, reportedly asked twice whether the dimensions had been confirmed before proceeding with the analysis. Could a primate this size truly exist undetected in these woods? More Bigfoot tracks appeared the following morning, a few hundred feet further down the road, identical in every particular to the first set. Then 3 more sets materialized by the end of the week, each perfectly preserved in the still damp soil, each showing the same 17-inch span, the same depth, the same smooth heel to forefoot transfer. The stride interval, the distance between left and right footfalls, indicated a step length consistent with a biped of extraordinary height, moving at an easy, unhurried pace. Not running, not lumbering, walking. The way something walks when it is moving toward a place it knows. Whatever Sasquatch had made these tracks was not injured. The stride showed none of the compensatory asymmetry that an injured limb produces, none of the lateral deviation that signals an animal favoring one side. It carried no additional load that would alter its center of gravity. It was not, by any measure, lost or disoriented. It moved the way a large, healthy animal moves when it is entirely at ease with its environment, the unself-conscious, efficient movement of a body that has made this particular journey many times before. That last quality, the ease, the lack of hesitation, was what the team kept returning to in the weeks that followed, in the conversations they had and the ones they didn't. Could they understand the pattern before it revealed something irreversible? The tracks didn't circle the facility in the exploratory way of an animal investigating unfamiliar territory. They didn't branch off and double back or meander toward the building and then veer away. The way that curiosity combined with wariness produces movement. They formed a straight line from the tree line to the facility and then, precisely, cleanly, without variation, returned along exactly the same path. The outbound and inbound impressions were so perfectly aligned in some stretches that investigators initially wondered whether they were looking at a single set of tracks rather than two. By the third week of rainfall events and subsequent inspections, Bigfoot's pattern had repeated enough times to move beyond any reasonable interpretation of coincidence. This was not a creature that had stumbled across the building and found something interesting. This was a creature that had known the building was there, had approached it with purpose, and had returned home afterward along a route it had walked so many times that it no longer needed to think about it. The difference between discovery and return is visible in the body, in the quality of movement, and everything about these tracks spoke of return. If the tracks and the door damage were connected, if something was returning to this place on a timetable, what could it possibly want inside? The interior evidence arrived the way most of the evidence in this investigation arrived, quietly, incrementally, in the form of things that were easy to dismiss until they weren't. During routine inspections in the weeks following the confirmation of exterior tracks, team members had been noting faint streaks along the corridor walls. Smudges from maintenance equipment, most likely. The ordinary residue of a working facility where carts and dollies and cleaning machinery move through tight spaces and leave their marks. Nobody thought twice about them. Somebody wiped them down. Except the height was wrong. The marks sat at roughly 8.5 feet above floor level, well beyond the reach of any standard piece of maintenance equipment, well beyond the casual reach of any person who might brush against a wall while carrying something. And they didn't scatter across the surface the way that incidental contact scatters. They followed the curvature of the corridor walls in a continuous, unbroken line. The trace of a body in motion, something large enough that its shoulder or upper arm or flank maintained sustained contact with the wall surface as it moved through the space, the way a person walking a narrow hallway might trail a hand along the wall, but at a height that belonged to nothing human. What force, intelligence, or habit was guiding these impossible marks? When cleaning staff reported that the marks reappeared almost immediately after standard cleaning cycles, sometimes within 24 hours, the explanation of incidental smudging became untenable. Something was touching these walls with enough regularity that the traces couldn't be fully removed before they were renewed. Laboratory analysis of swab samples collected from the streaks returned results that deepened the unease considerably. The lipid composition of the residue was inconsistent with any human source and inconsistent with any domestic animal source. More significantly, the layering of the deposit, the microscopic stratigraphy of oils and proteins accumulated against the painted concrete, indicated not a single contact event, but repeated contact sustained over a long period, each visit adding a new layer over the incompletely cleaned remnants of the last. The building had been absorbing this record for longer than anyone on the team had been assigned to the facility. Bigfoot had been moving through those corridors, regularly, repeatedly, for an unknown span of time, and it had left behind a chemical diary that the walls had quietly preserved. Could these walls tell a story the investigators weren't ready to hear? Traced across the full interior and mapped onto the facility's floor plan, the smear patterns formed a coherent route, from the main entrance, through a sequence of primary corridors, toward several secure rooms in the deeper interior. The path was consistent across every documented instance. It didn't vary, Whatever was moving through these spaces moved through them the same way every time, not exploring, not searching, but following a course so well established that deviation from it apparently never occurred. The biological evidence from the perimeter reinforced this picture with unsettling specificity. Hair recovered from the fencing wire, from the grills of exterior vent openings, and from the metal rails of interior stairwells, at heights requiring a vertical reach that would have been impossible for any human without a ladder, provided material for microscopic examination. The results were unambiguous in their strangeness. Hollow shafts with medullary structures that matched nothing in the regional mammal database. Not bear, not elk, not any of the larger animals known to range across that terrain. Growth cycle analysis of multiple samples indicated environmental weathering distributed across more than one seasonal cycle. The hair had not been deposited in a single recent event. It had accumulated over time, shed across visits the way any animal sheds, continuously, incidentally, leaving a little behind each time it passed. Outside the perimeter fence, the surrounding landscape had been keeping its own record. Investigators conducting routine sweeps in the third month began noticing something in the tree line along the facility's approach corridors. Twisted branches, bent limbs, the evidence of deliberate and sustained modification. These were not storm breaks. Clean fractures where sudden force had snapped a branch at its weakest point. They were twist fractures, the kind of damage produced by torque, by something gripping a branch and rotating it slowly until the wood fibers failed, then holding the result in its altered position long enough for the wood to begin to set. The limbs had been bent and held. Their new orientations, when mapped against the facility's access points and plotted alongside the track occurrences, were not random. They formed corridors through the tree line that converged, consistently, on the same monitored zones. But what kind of intelligence reshapes its environment over years of visits? And what was it finding inside the building that made all of that effort worthwhile? The protein residue appeared in the 5th month, in locations that added a new dimension to everything the investigation had established so far. It was found on ladder rungs in the utility shafts, on the concrete walls of the access tunnels, in the corners of 3 interior rooms identified by the wall residue mapping as the deepest points of the interior route. The deposits had accumulated in layers, the same patient stratigraphy as the lipid traces in the corridors, suggesting multiple visits over an extended period. Protein-rich compounds bearing markers consistent with physical exertion, the biological byproducts of a Bigfoot, working hard, climbing, maneuvering through tight vertical spaces, had been left behind in concentrations that increased with proximity to the interior resting sites. But it was the corner deposits that shifted the investigation's understanding most significantly. In the angles where 2 walls meet, in the natural shelter of enclosed space, the residue showed a different character, denser, more complex, bearing the markers not of exertion but of rest, of a large warm body settled against a surface for an extended period, of something that had come inside not merely to pass through, but to stop. The facility had been offering shelter, and whatever was visiting it had been accepting that offer repeatedly across seasons. The interior spaces, the secure rooms, the shielded corners, the areas deepest within the building, had been functioning as a refuge, a place to rest between the long movements through terrain that was, outside the building's walls, open and exposed and cold. Had the team unknowingly been hosting an occupant for years without realizing it? This realization changed the texture of everything the team had documented. The grip door panels were not acts of aggression or territorial marking. They were the marks of entry, of something that had learned which access points could be coaxed open, which panels yielded to sustained upward pressure, and had returned to those same points so many times that the steel bore a record of every visit. The corridor route, trodden so consistently that it left chemical traces on the walls, was the path between the entrance and the refuge. The modified tree line was the approach to a place that had become, in some meaningful sense, a destination. They were not dealing with intrusions. They were dealing with something far stranger, and in its own way, more remarkable, a Bigfoot that had incorporated a human facility into its own life, its shelter network, its movement pattern, its seasonal rhythm, and had been doing so quietly, invisibly, for years. The temperature logs confirmed this reading from a direction no one had anticipated. For as long as the environmental monitoring system had been operational, the logs had contained small, unexplained anomalies. Localized warm spots in rooms that had no active equipment, appearing during periods of scheduled inactivity, persisting for durations that didn't match any known electrical phenomenon. They had been attributed over the years to sensor drift, to residual heat from equipment recently powered down, to the vagaries of climate control systems in aging infrastructure. Nobody had looked at them as a pattern because nobody had reason to. What else had been quietly recorded that nobody had thought to check? Pulled from the archive and mapped against everything else the investigation had assembled, the thermal record transformed. The warm spots appeared in the same rooms, always the rooms at the deepest end of the corridor route, always the rooms where protein deposits had accumulated in corners. They rose gradually over the span of 30 to 40 minutes and fell slowly over an hour or more, the exact thermal profile of a large warm-blooded body entering an enclosed space, stabilizing its temperature against the ambient air, and then withdrawing. Not the abrupt spike of equipment cycling, not the rapid dissipation of residual heat from a recently active machine. The measured organic rise and fall of a living body occupying a room. If the building's own temperature sensors had been tracking these visits for years, what else might the facility's systems have recorded without anyone realizing it? Sound of Bigfoot was the second to the last piece of the physical record to be fully understood, and in certain ways, it was the most disquieting. Could hearing its presence finally reveal what sight and touch had only hinted at? The acoustic monitoring equipment positioned along the facility's perimeter had been installed for entirely practical reasons: to detect unauthorized vehicle access, to flag anomalous machinery noise, to provide an additional layer of environmental awareness in an isolated location where problems could go unnoticed for hours. The microphones were sensitive, calibrated for a broad frequency range, and had been running continuously for years. They had accumulated an enormous archive of ambient sound: wind through the ridge's tree line, the calls of birds, and the more distant cries of larger animals, the mechanical hum of the facility's own systems, the occasional acoustic artifact of weather. Within all of that, buried in hundreds of hours of unremarkable ambient recording, were sounds that did not belong. They had been noted occasionally in the logs: low-frequency vocalization, possible wildlife origin, undetermined source, wind artifact, probable. The notations were brief, the conclusions dismissive, the recordings unflagged for further review. Nobody had gone back to listen carefully because the context that would have made careful listening seem necessary did not yet exist. In the investigation's fourth month, with the thermal, physical, and biological record now largely assembled, a researcher working through the acoustic archive found the first clearly anomalous recording: a sequence of low-frequency sounds sustained over approximately 4 minutes, bearing a rising and falling modulation that was inconsistent with anything the facility's environmental profile could explain. Not wind. Wind through trees produces a broadband noise without the kind of discrete frequency variation this recording showed. Not a known animal. The calls of every large mammal in the regional database had been run against the sample, and none matched. Not mechanical. The facility's equipment produced no sounds in this frequency range during inactivity periods. Bigfoot sound had structure. It had, in the specific technical sense that acoustic analysts use the word, intentionality. A quality of rising and falling that implied not random noise, but produced vocalization, something generated by a larynx and shaped by the kind of neurological control that separates communication from ambient noise. Once this first recording was flagged, the archive review became targeted and systematic. Researchers pulled every acoustic anomaly from the full span of the archive, aligned them against the thermal and physical timeline, and found what they had, by this point, come to expect: a pattern. Low-frequency vocalizations appearing consistently during the same intervals as thermal elevation events. Sounds at the perimeter corresponding temporally to the arrivals and departures that the door deformation logs and track evidence had already documented. But the timing revealed something more specific still. In some recordings, the vocalizations preceded the interior thermal spikes by a narrow margin, 10, 15, 20 minutes, as though what was approaching had announced itself at the tree line before crossing the open ground to the entrance. In others, the sounds came after the thermal record had already begun its decline, trailing the withdrawal, marking the departure, the way a door closing behind someone marks the end of a visit. A few recordings captured both, a sound at arrival and a sound at departure, bracketing the thermal event the way a parenthetical statement brackets an aside. Beginning, middle, end. Each visit, the investigators now understood, had a complete acoustic shape. Bigfoot had a signature, the Sasquatch, and they had stopped by this point, pretending that the word was anything other than accurate, announced itself when it came and when it left, and the facility's own perimeter equipment had been faithfully recording both for longer than anyone cared to calculate. One recording, pulled from an archive 7 years old and run through enhancement software that had not existed when it was made, contained a sequence of sounds that stopped the acoustics researcher mid-session. She listened to it 3 times before calling a colleague. The modulation in that particular recording was more complex than in the others, more varied, longer, with what appeared to be a repetitive internal structure that recurred at intervals across the 4-minute sequence. She was careful in her notes about what language she used, possible structured patterning, repetitive internal motif, inconsistent with known environmental sources. But the language she used when she called her colleague was simpler and less careful. I think it might be saying something. Nobody followed that thread any further. There was, perhaps, a limit to how far down any of them were willing to go. The sounds had structure. The visits had a rhythm. The evidence had been accumulating for years, in every system the facility contained. What would the cameras, the eyes of the building, finally show? The surveillance system had never been designed with this in mind. The cameras were operational tools installed to monitor the movement of people and machinery through a working facility. Their placement had followed the logic of security rather than investigation. Doors, corridors, storage areas, the primary approaches to the building. The first sequence to yield something unambiguous came from an exterior camera positioned near a service entrance, one of the access points the structural analysis had already identified years earlier as a repeated site of panel deformation. The recording was from a winter night nearly 2 decades old. The ambient light in the frame was the low, diffuse illumination of a clear night at altitude, sufficient to read detail in familiar objects, insufficient to resolve detail in unfamiliar ones. The frame darkened gradually, not the sudden eclipse of a passing cloud, not the irregular flicker of branches moving in the wind. A gradual, steady occlusion of ambient light across a portion of the frame, as though something large and opaque was moving into the camera's field from one side, blocking the light sources beyond it, with the steady, deliberate progress of a body bearing consistent weight and moving with directional intent. The darkening tracked from right to left across the lower portion of the frame, unhurried, steady, the visual signature of mass in motion rather than weather or atmospheric effect. When the footage was set against the door deformation log from the same night, the correspondence was exact. The frame darkened at the precise moment the structural sensors had registered strain on the access panel. The door shifted visibly, a small movement caught only because the analysts knew to look for it, because they had been told where and when the strain sensors had recorded their data. And then the darkness moved beyond the camera's field of view, leaving behind only the residual visual disturbance of its passage. Interior footage from the same night continued the sequence without interruption. A corridor camera mounted near the main hallway junction recorded something crossing its field approximately 11 minutes after the exterior camera's event. A broad, textured silhouette moving from left to right across the lower portion of the frame. Not the sharp, quick-edged outline of a person passing at standard walking speed, but a slower, heavier displacement, something that absorbed the ambient light rather than reflecting it, that moved at a height which corresponded precisely to the residue streaks the lipid analysis had mapped along those same walls. Across the full span of the documented footage, covering visits distributed across nearly 2 decades, Bigfoot's pattern never broke. Different seasons, different lighting conditions, different cameras, different years. The same structure, the same route, the same rhythm, the same quality of unhurried familiarity. A record of Bigfoot that had learned this place thoroughly and completely. Learned it the way you learn a place that has become, over years of return, a part of your own geography. After 20 years of visits recorded across every system the building contained, what does it mean that the visits, as far as anyone could determine, had never stopped? The visit cycle, when the team last checked, remained at every 2 to 4 weeks, as regular as it had ever been. Bigfoot had learned this place had not stopped coming, and now, at last, we have learned to see it. For the first time ever, a camera caught Bigfoot doing something nobody has ever seen. A wildlife filmmaker managed to capture the undoubted proof of his existence, and what he shot is the most shocking thing Bigfoot has done in history. Thomas Bannister had spent 20 years pointing cameras at animals in the Pacific Northwest forests. He had filmed bear behavior in the Cascades, followed wolfpack dynamics across 3 winters in Idaho, and spent 3 consecutive winters embedded with a Roosevelt elk herd in the Olympic Peninsula. He understood large animal behavior the way someone understands anything they have spent 2 decades watching closely, not from textbooks, but from the accumulated weight of having seen what was normal so many times that the first moment something was not normal registered before he could have explained why. He knew what hunting looked like. He knew what instinct looked like. What he watched on his editing screen on November 8, 2016, was neither of those things. It was something he did not have a word for yet, and the word he eventually settled on, after a year of working through what the footage meant, was the reason he made a decision at the end of that year that most people in his field thought was wrong. He withheld evidence, deliberately. He had a second clip, captured almost a year after the first, and he chose not to release it, not because he doubted what it showed, but because of what a year of studying the first clip had taught him about what was living in that forest. And the reasoning behind that decision is the part of this story that does not resolve cleanly. Thomas had arrived at the Hoh River area of Olympic National Park in late October 2016, following Roosevelt elk through the early stages of their winter migration. The Hoh rainforest was old-growth Pacific Northwest at its most dense. Douglas fir and Sitka spruce with canopies so thick that midday light barely touched the ground. The river flats pulled elk down from the ridges, and the game trails were ancient, worn so deep into the soil by generations of the same animals using the same routes for so many years that the paths looked more like trenches than trails. Thomas had been in this area before. He knew the river crossings. He knew the game trails. He knew exactly which crossing to put a camera on to get footage worth driving all the way from Seattle for. He bolted a high-resolution motion-activated unit 12 feet up a Douglas fir on November 1st, angled toward a shallow crossing point where fresh elk tracks showed the animals had been coming through regularly. The camera could record in clear detail even in near darkness, and its trigger was fast enough to catch almost any animal that moved through the frame. Thomas checked the angle, made sure the battery was full, and drove back to his camp near the park entrance. He planned to come back in 5 days, pull the memory card, see what he had, and reposition the camera if he needed to. He pulled the card on November 8th. He was expecting elk footage. The clip from 6:44 a.m. on November 3rd opened on a normal dawn scene. Soft gray light coming through the trees, the river moving slow and dark, a section of muddy bank where the water got shallow enough to cross without much trouble. The motion trigger had caught a young black-tailed deer stepping into the shot from the left side of the frame, picking its way carefully down the bank toward the water with the nervous start and stop walk of an animal that was paying attention to its surroundings but had not picked up on anything specific to be scared of yet. The deer looked like it weighed around 90 pounds, young, still a little unsure of itself, ears swiveling to catch any sound, nose testing the cool morning air. It reached the edge of the water and put its head down to drink. The camera was still running when the big cedar tree on the right side of the frame suddenly had something behind it that had not been there a moment before. Bigfoot stepped out from behind the trunk of a massive old-growth cedar about 40 feet from the deer and placed itself with a kind of slow, deliberate purpose that was completely unlike anything Thomas had seen in 20 years of wildlife filming. It did not wander in. It did not step through. It placed itself. One moment the cedar was just a cedar. The next moment something was using it as a hide, and the way it tucked in behind the trunk, the exact angle it picked to stay out of the deer's sightline, the instant total stillness it dropped into the moment it was in position. All of it communicated one thing without any ambiguity at all. This was a plan, already in progress before the camera caught it. Bigfoot was at least 8 feet tall. Its hair was dark brown with lighter coloring across the face and chest, and the individual hairs were clearly visible in the morning light, moving slightly in the river breeze the way real hair moves, the way actual individual strands shift at different speeds when the wind catches them, darker along the spine and thicker on the arms where the coat was more matted. Its shoulders were wider than anything Thomas had ever pointed a camera at. Its arms, visible where they gripped the bark of the cedar, hung past its knees. Its hands, spread out flat against the tree trunk, covered what Thomas would later estimate at nearly 3 feet of bark, and then nothing moved, not once. The deer kept drinking, head down, completely unaware. Bigfoot had not made a sound. The position it had chosen put it in the cedar shadow and broke up its outline enough that from the deer's direction it was almost invisible. And that was not an accident. To choose that specific position required knowing in advance where the deer would be looking. The deer had been completely outthought. 17 seconds passed. The camera recorded every one of them. During those 17 seconds, Bigfoot didn't move a single time. No weight shifts, no muscle twitches, none of the small involuntary movements that every large animal makes simply from being alive. Its head stayed locked on the deer, tracking without a single adjustment. Whatever was happening in Bigfoot's mind, the body was under a level of voluntary control that had no equivalent in any predator Thomas had ever studied. He would later say the stillness was the most disturbing part of the whole clip, not what came after it, but what it implied about what was going on before. Then it launched? That was the word Thomas used every single time he described what came next. Not ran, not charged, launched. From total stillness to full speed in what looked like a single movement. No building, no transition, no middle stage. One moment completely still behind the cedar. The next moment covering ground at a speed the camera's microphone recorded as heavy thumping impacts, each one barely a fraction of a second apart. Each one hitting like something very large and very fast was making contact with the earth. 40 feet in under 3 seconds. The deer's head came up at the second footfall. Its legs loaded, its hindquarters dropped, its whole body gathered to run. The exact sequence of a prey animal that has just understood it needs to leave right now. The reaction was fast. Any predator that Forrest had, mountain lion, bear, wolf, would have watched the deer clear the gap. Bigfoot was already there before the deer's legs could fire. What happened at the moment of contact was the part of the footage that made every person who watched it go quiet. Bigfoot did not drive the deer to the ground, did not crash into it, did not do what any predator in that ecosystem would do, use body mass and impact to bring it down. Instead, in one motion, flowing directly out of the sprint, Bigfoot reached down with one arm and simply picked the deer up. One arm, one motion. A 90-pound animal in full panic, legs pumping against nothing, throwing its body weight in every direction, and Bigfoot absorbed all of it without breaking stride. The deer ended up tucked under Bigfoot's arm like a carried object, controlled and going nowhere, while Bigfoot crossed the remaining stretch of riverbank and hit the tree line at the same speed it had been running since the cedar. By the time it reached the trees, nothing about the way it moved suggested it was carrying anything at all, just the deer's legs sticking out, still kicking. and the sounds the deer was making, still audible on the camera's microphone, until the forest took both of them. 31 seconds from Bigfoot's first appearance to the moment the trees closed behind it. The camera kept recording for 2 more minutes after that, showing nothing but the empty riverbank and the slow-moving water. The section of the bank where the deer had been drinking looked completely undisturbed. No blood, no tracks scattered in panic patterns, no fur or debris of the kind any other predator encounter leaves behind. The scene looked almost exactly the same as it had before any of it occurred, which was its own kind of disturbing because it meant this was practiced. A cleanup this complete, an exit this clean and fast, did not happen by accident the first time. And if it was not the first time, then this river crossing had a history that nobody had been present to document. The deer that had come to this water source over months and years before Thomas's camera arrived had come and gone from a crossing that was being hunted regularly, and no evidence of any of it had been left behind for anyone to find. Thomas watched the clip 7 times before he drove back to Seattle. He spent the first full day running every check he knew from 2 decades of documentary work. The hair moved differently on different parts of Bigfoot's body, the strands across its shoulders responding to the breeze differently than the thicker matted sections lower down its arms, exactly the way real hair of different lengths behaves in wind. Beneath the hair, the muscles of its shoulders and upper back were visibly working as it ran, in the same shifting, rolling pattern that any large running animal produces. During the stillness behind the cedar, Bigfoot's chest rose and fell with its breathing. He spent a long time on the hands. The grip on the cedar trunk was 5-fingered, each finger fully wrapped around the bark, with a span that no human hand came close to matching. The single-arm scoop that lifted a panicked 90-pound animal mid-sprint, one smooth downward motion, complete control, no visible exertion, no change in pace. Thomas had spent 20 years filming large animals. He understood enough about what bodies could and could not do to know that what he had just watched placed Bigfoot in a category of physical strength that nothing he had ever filmed belonged to. He ran the speed numbers multiple ways. The distance from the cedar to the deer was 40 feet, a measurement he had made himself on his last visit to the location. Bigfoot had covered that distance in under 3 seconds, starting from a complete standstill, maintaining that speed through the grab, and through carrying a struggling animal all the way to the forest edge. The numbers he kept arriving at were somewhere between 25 and 28 miles per hour. Bigfoot's estimated weight, based on body proportions, put it in the same class as a large male grizzly bear. A grizzly's top sprint is faster, but only over short distances and with nothing to carry. The combination of that speed, that weight, and that grip strength while managing a 90-pound struggling animal had no match in any wildlife data Thomas could find. But the speed, by the time he had finished analyzing the 17 seconds, was almost beside the point. He reached out to a wildlife biologist he had worked with before, someone who ran an independent research station near Ashford and had a reputation for careful, skeptical work. The biologist watched the footage, asked for a second copy, and called Thomas back the same evening. The call went on for 2 hours. What the biologist kept returning to was not the speed or the strength, it was the 17 seconds. Those 17 seconds had no match anywhere in the documented behavior of large North American predators. Not bears, not mountain lions, the most patient ambush hunters in the region. Nothing in their behavioral records showed what the footage showed. Deliberate selection of a specific piece of cover based on the prey's approach direction, holding that position through 2 alert responses without a single movement, and timing the launch to the exact moment of maximum exposure. That was not predatory instinct, that was a hunting strategy. The biologist said those words carefully. Not a behavior, not a reflex, not an instinct, a strategy. Then the biologist brought up the cedar tree itself, and this was the point in the analysis where the question shifted from what Bigfoot could do to what Bigfoot knew. That game trail was old. The path had been worn into the soil by deer and elk, using the same route to the same water source for so many generations that it looked carved. Any large animal spending regular time in that forest would have crossed that trail many times and would have seen deer and elk using it repeatedly. The cedar Bigfoot used for cover was the single best concealment position at that approach angle, the only piece of cover that worked from the direction the deer had come from. To have chosen it, Bigfoot had to have known in advance which direction the deer would come from. That was not something figured out in the moment. That was accumulated knowledge of a specific hunting ground, built through repeated experience in that specific territory, which meant this was not Bigfoot's first hunt at this crossing, which meant Bigfoot had been hunting this river crossing from that cedar using that game trail long before Thomas's camera arrived, long before Thomas had ever been in this forest. And the deer that had come to this water source over those months and years had no idea what was waiting for them because Bigfoot had never given them a reason to find out. The biologist flagged one more thing in a follow-up call 3 days later. The deer had actually paused twice on its approach, once at the tree line, again at about 15 feet from the bank, rotating its ears and lifting its nose, doing the careful scanning of an animal that has registered something vaguely wrong without being able to identify a specific threat. The deer had, on some level, sensed something was there, and Bigfoot had held perfectly frozen through both of those moments. Not a twitch, not a readjustment. Nothing that let the deer's alarm system lock on and confirm. The biologist said he had spent years studying predator-prey dynamics in Pacific Northwest forests and had never documented any large predator with the impulse control to hold position through 2 close-range alert responses. That level of control, he said, was not something animals had. It was something that thinking things had. Thomas reached out to a second expert, a video forensics specialist who ran a small independent lab outside of Olympia and had done authenticity work on documentary footage before. He sent the full video file with all of the camera's built-in data left intact, the compression information, the timestamps from the internal clock, the GPS location data written directly into the file. He asked for a complete analysis and deliberately did not tell the technician anything about what the footage showed. The technician came back 8 days later with a full report. It went through every technical indicator of digital manipulation that video forensics tools could detect. How compression artifacts behaved across the file, whether the timestamps matched up correctly, how motion blur worked at the edges of the moving subject, whether the lighting stayed consistent as Bigfoot moved from shadow into the early morning light near the river, whether shadow directions matched the actual sun position for that timestamp, and GPS location. The report found 0 indicators of manipulation. Everything was consistent with genuine footage captured by that camera model under those lighting conditions on that morning. The technician added a personal note at the end. If someone had faked the footage, they would have needed to do it at a level of technical skill beyond anything achievable with standard equipment, and would have needed to know the exact position of a hidden elk camera, the exact time a deer would approach that crossing, and the exact quality of the light that specific morning. The simpler explanation, the technician wrote, was that the footage was real. Thomas presented the clip at a closed cryptozoology conference in British Columbia in December 2016. He put together a presentation that included the raw clip, his own frame-by-frame breakdown, and both independent expert reports. He had decided going in that he was not going to try to push the audience toward any particular conclusion. No dramatic voiceover, no leading questions, no attempt to get ahead of what people were thinking while they watched. He showed the clip, shared the data, and let the 31 seconds do the work. The response was the kind of divided, tense silence that precedes serious argument, because everyone in that room understood what the hunting sequence meant. Not a large primate opportunistically finding food. An apex predator with a defined method, deep territorial knowledge, and physical capabilities that placed it above every other predator in the Olympic Peninsula. The researchers who had spent years building behavioral evidence for Bigfoot's existence understood right away what they were looking at. The skeptics focused on what was missing: no carcass, no hair, no castable prints. Footage alone had never been considered enough. But underneath both reactions was the question that the hunting sequence actually raised, the one that did not resolve into either category. Not whether the footage was real, not whether more evidence was needed. How long had something with that level of hunting intelligence been operating in that forest, using those specific crossings, making decisions based on that specific territorial knowledge? And how many other forests were there, with their own crossings and their own cedar trees, where the same thing had been happening without a single trail camera ever being in the right place at the right time? Thomas announced at the conference that he was going back to the Olympic Peninsula in the spring of 2017 with a small team and proper search equipment, with the goal of finding physical evidence at and around the site. He was not done with the Hoh River corridor. Whatever had been using that cedar as a regular hunting position had been doing it before his camera arrived, and he believed it was still doing it. The spring 2017 trip brought him back to the river crossing with a 3-person team and equipment that included sensors for detecting buried organic material and dogs trained to locate wildlife remains. They searched the area around the cedar for 4 full days, expanding outward in the direction Bigfoot had gone when it left the frame. They found disturbed vegetation in a pattern consistent with the exit path. They found one partial impression in soft ground near the river's edge, too weathered to cast, but large enough and correctly oriented to be consistent with a very large bipedal footprint. That was it. The forest had done what Pacific Northwest old growth does. 4 months of rain and heavy biological activity had broken down and absorbed whatever evidence had been there. Nothing was left to recover. Thomas came back to Seattle with the spring findings and added them to the file he had been building since November. The partial imprint photographs, the mapped vegetation disturbance, the forensic lab report, the biologist's behavioral analysis, the speed and strength breakdown from his frame-by-frame work on the original footage. He compiled it into a single document and sent copies to the small group of researchers he trusted to handle it seriously. In September 2017, he returned again. He set cameras at 12 locations within a 2-mile radius, not to catch Bigfoot directly, because he had already understood that the original clip had only happened because the camera was there for elk. Whatever awareness Bigfoot had about human activity in its territory put it at a permanent advantage over any camera placed deliberately to find it. He went back to understand the territory, what Bigfoot used, how it moved through the forest over time. The cameras ran through fall and into early winter 2017. Several captured elk footage exactly as planned. One caught a black bear working a section of riverbank about half a mile north of the original location. 3 recorded nothing except the forest changing light and weather across the recording window. One camera, set up on a ridge overlooking the river corridor about 3/4 of a mile southeast of the cedar tree, caught something on the evening of October 19th, 2017. Something large and upright, moving through the thick undergrowth at the top of the ridge with the steady, unhurried pace of an animal that was not startled and was not in any rush to get somewhere. It was in the frame for less than 4 seconds, and the low light had pushed the image quality down to the point where specific details were hard to make out. But the shape was the same. The silhouette, how wide the shoulders were, how long the arms were compared to the rest of the body height, the 2-legged stride, matched what Thomas had spent the better part of a year studying in careful detail from the November 2016 clip. Whatever had used that cedar tree as a hunting blind was still in that forest almost a year later, still moving through it, still unhurried, still invisible to every deliberately placed camera in a 2-mile grid, and only caught it all because one unit happened to be pointed at the right ridge at the right moment. Thomas added the clip to his file and made the hardest professional decision of his career. He chose not to release it, not because he doubted what it showed, because a year of working through the behavioral evidence in the original footage had brought him to a specific conclusion about what kind of intelligence was operating in the Hoh River corridor. And that conclusion made him genuinely uncomfortable with the idea of directing more human attention into the territory it was living in. The 31 seconds had started as a question about what Bigfoot was. By the end of 12 months, it had become a question about what happens when something that intelligent, that capable, that practiced in remaining invisible, what happens when the world finds out exactly where it is. The November 2016 footage showed something faster than every other animal in that forest, stronger than every other animal in that forest, patient enough to hold 17 seconds of perfect voluntary stillness while a prey animal closed the distance. Strategic enough to have chosen its hide based on advanced knowledge of how that specific animal would approach that specific water source. It had taken a 90-pound deer in a single-arm grab at full sprint, disappeared into old-growth timber in 31 seconds, and left a scene so undisturbed that the river crossing looked exactly as it had before any of it occurred. That footage, 31 seconds on a November morning by the Hoh River, remained the most complete behavioral documentation of Bigfoot ever captured. Not because of what it showed about Bigfoot's size or appearance, because of what those 17 seconds of total stillness before the sprint revealed about what was happening behind its eyes. The speed was extraordinary, the strength was extraordinary, but the plan, the selection of that cedar at that angle, based on that knowledge of that trail, was what put this footage in a different category from every piece of Bigfoot evidence that had come before it. What Thomas Bannister's trail camera caught on November 3, 2016, was not a Bigfoot sighting. It was a predator operating inside a territory it understood completely. Faster than everything else in that forest, stronger than everything else in that forest, invisible to every deliberately placed camera in a 2-mile search grid for the entire following year, and apparently aware enough of human activity in its range to have adjusted its behavior accordingly. The 31 seconds of footage had started as a question about what Bigfoot was. The year that followed turned it into a question Thomas eventually decided he was not willing to answer out loud. What would happen to that territory and to what was living in it if the rest of the world came to understand exactly what it was capable of? He had a second clip. He kept it to himself, and the Hoh River corridor kept going, old growth and rain and game trails worn deep into the earth. And somewhere in it, if the October 2017 footage meant what Thomas believed it meant, the cedar tree by the river crossing was still there and still being used, and the deer still had no idea. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, check out this one. Recordings of Bigfoot only show how elusive it is, but I captured him speaking extraordinary words. The Sasquatch looked me dead in the eyes as my GoPro recorded the exact moment it spoke to me in broken English, and what it said has left me shook until this day. I had been documenting everything from the moment we first heard the wood knocks echoing through the valley 3 days prior, my voice steady and professional as I described the patterns and intervals. But now, my words came out in fractured gasps as I tried to maintain some semblance of scientific observation while my body screamed at me to just run faster and forget about recording anything at all. When I risked a glance over my shoulder, I caught my first clear glimpse of the shape that had been pursuing us for the last quarter mile through increasingly difficult terrain. It was massive and upright with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad, even at this distance, and the way it moved between the trees was deliberate and controlled, rather than the crashing panic I would have expected from any known animal, its long arms swinging in a rhythm that spoke of intelligence and intent rather than mindless aggression. It really is Bigfoot. Torin was still shouting, but his voice had taken on a different quality now, less panic and more something that sounded like anger or frustration, and I realized with a sick twist in my gut that he was yelling about getting better footage and not wasting this opportunity, while I was focused entirely on maintaining enough distance to avoid being caught by something that was clearly toying with us rather than actually trying to close the gap. Would Torin's obsession with footage jeopardize both our safety and my chance to document the creature responsibly? The ground began to slope downward more steeply, and I could hear water somewhere ahead, the white noise of it building into what had to be a substantial waterfall or rapids, and my boots were sliding in the duff and mud as I half ran and half controlled my fall down the incline. Behind me, the impacts had changed rhythm slightly, and I knew without looking that whatever was following us had also adjusted its pace to match the terrain, demonstrating a level of situational awareness that sent chills racing down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold sweat soaking through my layers. I burst into a clearing that opened up so suddenly it was disorienting. the space maybe 40 feet across and dominated by a waterfall that cascaded down a basalt cliff face in multiple tiers before pooling into a creek that vanished back into the forest downstream. The clearing was carpeted in moss that glowed an almost luminescent green in the shafts of sunlight that actually penetrated here, and scattered boulders that had calved off from the cliff face over the centuries provided the only breaks in the otherwise smooth expanse. I spun around with the GoPro raised and my breath coming in harsh sobs that I was trying to quiet so I could listen, and for several heartbeats there was nothing but the sound of the water and Torin crashing through the undergrowth somewhere to my left, still shouting about angles and documentation. Then the bushes at the clearing's edge simply parted, and it stepped through into the open space with a deliberateness that froze me in place more effectively than any amount of speed or aggression could have done. The Sasquatch was at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark auburn hair that was longer and more varied in texture than I had expected from the grainy footage and blurry photographs that I had studied for years before this expedition, with areas of lighter coloring around what I could only describe as its face, even though calling it a face felt both accurate and completely inadequate. The body proportions were wrong for any great ape I had ever seen, the torso barrel-shaped, and the arms long enough that the hands hung past where the knees would be on a human, and those hands were massive with fingers that looked capable of crushing bone without any particular effort. Could these proportions hint at evolutionary differences I had never considered? But at Bigfoot's eyes that stopped my breath entirely, because they were not the blank animal stare I had half expected, but instead held something that I could only describe as awareness and assessment, and what might have been curiosity. It stopped perhaps 20 feet from where I stood with the GoPro still raised and its head tilted slightly to one side as it regarded me with an expression that I found myself reading as thoughtful, despite knowing that I was probably projecting human attributes onto something that was decidedly not human. My voice came out barely above a whisper, but I was still narrating into the camera out of pure habit, describing the muscle structure visible beneath the hair, and the way it was breathing slowly and deliberately rather than showing any signs of exertion from the chase. Torin finally burst into the clearing behind me, still yelling something about positioning and making sure I got everything in frame, but the creature's eyes never left me, and it made no acknowledgement of his presence at all, which seemed significant in a way I could not quite articulate. I lowered the GoPro slightly and held up my other hand palm out in what I hoped was a universal gesture of non-aggression, and I found myself speaking directly to it rather than to the camera for the first time since we had started running. I told it that we were not there to hurt it, that we wanted to understand, that I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove that something like it existed, and that this moment meant more to me than I could possibly explain, but that I would leave right now if that was what it wanted. The silence that followed felt impossibly heavy and stretched out for what was probably only seconds, but felt like entire minutes. And then it made a sound that was definitely not an animal vocalization because it had structure and intentional modulation. The voice was deep and resonant in a way that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears, and the words came out slowly and carefully spaced, as though it was considering each one before committing to it aloud. It told me to stay, and to watch, and to not run, and each word was distinct and understandable, even though the pronunciation was slightly off in ways that suggested a vocal apparatus not quite designed for human speech. I felt my legs go weak and had to lock my knees to stay upright as the full implication crashed over me. Because this was not some clever animal mimicking sounds it had heard, this was deliberate communication with comprehension of meaning and context. Could I document this without losing control of my own fear? Torin had stopped shouting, and I could hear his breathing harsh and quick somewhere behind me, and I knew without looking that his face would have that expression it got when he was calculating value and potential rather than actually processing the profound nature of what was happening. The creature's eyes flicked toward him for just a moment, and something in its expression shifted in a way that made my stomach clench with an anxiety I could not quite name. But then its attention returned to me, and it repeated its instruction to stay and watch, with a patience that felt almost deliberate. I slowly raised the GoPro again and asked it if this was okay, using the camera to gesture toward it in a way that I hoped made my question clear. And after a pause, it made a sound that might have been affirmative before turning its attention toward the waterfall and the creek. It moved to one of the larger boulders and settled into a crouch that somehow managed to look both alert and relaxed, and I realized it was demonstrating that it intended to remain here and that it expected us to do the same. My scientific training was warring with complete overwhelmed shock as I tried to maintain some kind of observational framework, and I began speaking softly into the camera again as I described everything I was seeing. I found myself asking questions aloud without really thinking about whether it would respond. Questions about who it was, and whether there were others, and how long it had been in this valley. The answers came slowly and with significant pauses between words, and I had the sense that it was translating concepts that might not have direct equivalents in English into something I could understand. It told me about family and home in words that were simple, but conveyed depths of meaning through tone and the slight changes in posture that accompanied them. And I realized I was witnessing something that would fundamentally alter everything we thought we understood about human evolution and the development of language. How could I process the implications of this knowledge without alerting Torin to my full understanding? Behind me, I could hear Torin moving around the clearing, trying to get different angles with his phone, and the creature tracked his movements with its eyes in a way that was distinctly wary, even as it continued to respond to my questions. I asked it how it had survived here without being discovered by the logging operations and hiking trails that crisscrossed these mountains. And its response involved words about watching and hiding and being quiet that came with a directness that suggested this was a learned survival skill rather than instinctive behavior. The sunlight filtering into the clearing was shifting as the afternoon progressed, and I had lost all sense of how long we had been standing there in this impossible conversation. But I was increasingly aware that the creature was assessing me as much as I was documenting it. Its questions came less frequently than mine, but they were pointed and specific, asking about why we had come here and what we wanted and whether we would bring others. And I found myself answering with an honesty that surprised me because lying to something this intelligent felt both impossible and morally wrong. I told it about my research and my years of following reports and alleged sightings, about the academic ridicule and the skepticism I had faced from colleagues who dismissed the entire field as pseudoscience and wishful thinking. I explained about Torin and his interest in documentation and funding, and how our goals for this expedition had not always aligned as clearly as they should have, and I watched something in the creature's expression shift when I mentioned Torin's name in a way that made the anxiety in my gut intensify into something closer to dread. What was it about Torin that had triggered this reaction, and how could that affect the encounter? It asked me about the camera and what I intended to do with what I was recording, and I knew that this was somehow a test or a threshold moment that would determine what happened next. I told it the truth, that the footage would prove its existence and change everything, but that I would respect its wishes if it wanted me to delete it, and the internal war between my life's work and the ethics of the situation was probably visible on my face because the creature made a sound that might have been understanding or sympathy. Its response was complex and involved multiple attempts to find the right words. But what I understood was that it knew about cameras and had seen humans with them before, that it understood the implications of being documented, and that it had made a conscious choice to allow this interaction to continue. This was not an accidental encounter or a creature that had been surprised by hikers and had no choice but to confront us. This was a deliberate decision made with full awareness of the consequences. And that realization made everything that had happened feel even more surreal and significant. Torin finally spoke up from where he had positioned himself near the edge of the clearing, his voice carrying a sharpness that made me wince because I could hear the greed and calculation in it even if he thought he was being subtle. He was talking about getting closer for better details and about the value of clear facial footage, and I watched the creature's entire posture change from something that had been almost relaxed into something that was unmistakably threatening, even though it had not actually moved from its position on the boulder. I turned and told Torin to shut up and stay exactly where he was, with an urgency in my voice that must have gotten through because he actually stopped talking mid-sentence. And when I looked back at the creature, it was staring directly at him with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I found myself speaking quickly, trying to de-escalate whatever line had just been crossed, explaining that my partner sometimes did not think before he spoke, and that we would maintain whatever distance made it comfortable. Could I calm the situation before it escalated beyond negotiation? The creature's attention shifted back to me slowly, and I could see it thinking through the situation with a deliberation that was both fascinating and terrifying. And then it did something I had not expected at all by making a vocalization that was clearly not directed at me, but instead carried out into the forest beyond the clearing. The sound was structured and rhythmic with variations in pitch and tone that suggested something far more complex than a simple call. And I felt my heart rate spike as I realized it was summoning others and that we were about to have an entirely different kind of encounter than the one-on-one communication we had established. The response came from multiple directions at once, voices that were similar to the one that had been speaking with me, but distinct in their pitch and resonance, and I felt my legs begin to tremble as I realized we were about to be surrounded by something we had no framework for understanding. The creature on the boulder made another vocalization that was shorter and seemed to carry a different intent, and the answering calls adjusted their tone in a way that suggested acknowledgement or agreement, and I was struck by the complexity of what I was witnessing, even as pure instinctive terror tried to override my ability to observe and document. The first one to enter the clearing came from the northeast, parting the undergrowth with hands that looked even more massive than those of the one who had been speaking with me. And it was clear immediately that this individual was larger and more heavily built, with shoulders that had to be at least 4 feet across. The coloring was darker with patches of silver gray around what I could only think of as the face and chest, and when it moved into the open space, it did so with an authority that made every other living thing in the clearing feel suddenly very small and insignificant. Would this alpha-like presence decide we were a threat or something worth tolerating? 2 more appeared almost simultaneously from different points along the clearing's perimeter, these ones smaller, and what I guessed might be younger, based on the slightly less developed muscle structure and the way they positioned themselves in clear deference to the larger individual. Their hair was more uniformly brown, without the color variations I had noted in the first one, and they were silent as they took up positions that formed a loose semicircle around where Torin and I stood with our cameras still raised, because I was not about to stop documenting. Even if my hands were shaking so badly, the footage was probably going to be unusable. Another 3 emerged over the next several minutes, and I was frantically trying to note the differences between them while maintaining enough awareness to track their positions and movements, because I was suddenly very conscious of the fact that we were completely surrounded and that any route of escape had been effectively cut off by what was clearly a coordinated and intentional action. The sizes varied from perhaps 7 feet to well over 9, and the variations in coloring and build suggested different ages and possibly different roles within whatever social structure they maintained. The largest one, the silver-backed individual who had entered first, made a sound that was somehow both vocalization and something else, a deep thrumming that I felt resonate in my chest cavity and made my teeth ache with the subsonic components. The others responded with sounds that were clearly deferential, lower in volume and shorter in duration, and I watched as the one who had been speaking with me earlier rose from its position on the boulder and approached the larger individual with its head slightly lowered and its hands held away from its body in a gesture that was unmistakably submissive. Would the Alpha accept us as non-threats, or was this assessment only the beginning of judgment? What followed was an exchange that involved vocalizations I could not parse, along with physical gestures and postures that spoke of a social hierarchy as complex as anything I had observed in great apes or social primates, and I found myself narrating into the GoPro in a whisper that was probably too quiet to pick up clearly, but I could not risk speaking any louder. The silver-backed one turned its attention to me after this exchange, and I felt the full weight of its assessment in a way that was fundamentally different from the first creature's curiosity, because this was evaluation and judgment, and the decision about whether we represented a threat or something that could be tolerated. I did the only thing I could think of, and repeated what I had said to the first one, speaking slowly and clearly about our intentions and our desire to understand rather than harm. And I made sure to keep my body language as non-threatening as possible while maintaining eye contact, because I had the sense that looking away would be interpreted as deception or weakness. The silver-backed one tilted its head in a gesture that mirrored what the first creature had done, and then it spoke with a voice that was somehow even deeper and more resonant than I had expected. It asked me about fear and about truth, and about what I intended to do with the images I was capturing. And each question came with a weight that suggested it already knew the answers and was testing whether I would be honest or attempt to deceive. I told it that yes, I was afraid, but that fear did not mean I wanted to cause harm, that I had spoken truthfully about my research and my intentions, and that what I did with the footage would depend on what it and the others wanted, because I was beginning to understand that this was their territory and their choice, and that I was here only because they were allowing it. Could I convince them that our presence was not a violation, but a chance for understanding? The response came after a long pause during which I was aware of all the others watching and listening, and what it told me fundamentally changed my understanding of what these beings were and what this encounter meant. It spoke about watching humans for generations, about understanding our languages and our behaviors and our capacity for both destruction and occasionally something that might be respect or cooperation. And it made clear that this conversation was happening because they had collectively decided that perhaps the time had come for humans to know they existed and to understand that this knowledge came with responsibilities and boundaries. I felt tears starting to track down my face, and I did not bother to wipe them away because I was holding the GoPro with one hand and I did not want to make any sudden movements. And I asked it why now, and why us, and what it expected us to do with this impossible gift of knowledge. The answer involved multiple individuals contributing words and sounds, a conversation that was clearly happening between them as much as it was being directed at me. And I understood that this was not a decision that had been made lightly or quickly, but rather something they had been considering and debating among themselves. What I learned in the next hour as the afternoon light continued to shift and change was more than I could have imagined possible, because they were willing to answer questions and demonstrate behaviors and allow me to observe interactions that revealed depths of culture and social complexity that made my academic training feel inadequate and reductive. They showed me how they communicated through combinations of vocalization and gesture, and something that might have been percussion using specific rhythms beaten out on their chests or on nearby logs. And I watched hierarchical interactions that involved what I could only describe as negotiation and consensus building rather than simple dominance displays. The younger ones were more curious and approached closer despite clear signals from the adults to maintain distance, and I noted the way the older individuals would redirect them with gentle physical contact and low vocalizations that seemed to serve an educational or corrective function. One of the smaller ones reached out toward my GoPro with obvious fascination, and I held very still as massive fingers that could have crushed the camera without effort instead traced its outline with unexpected delicacy, and the creature made a questioning sound that I interpreted as asking how it worked. I found myself explaining in simple terms about lenses and recording and how the device captured images and sounds, and I was aware that I was probably anthropomorphizing, but the attention and interest seemed genuinely focused on understanding rather than simple curiosity. The adult nearest to us, one of the medium-sized individuals with reddish-brown coloring, made a sound that caused the younger one to withdraw its hand. And then it spoke to me about teaching and learning, and about how the young ones needed to understand both humans and the dangers they represented. Was this exchange my chance to build trust, or was one wrong word enough to break it? Torin had been uncharacteristically silent for most of this extended interaction, but I could hear him moving around the perimeter of the space we had been implicitly confined to. And I was increasingly worried about what he might do, because I knew his patience for observation without action was limited. The creatures were clearly tracking his movements as well, and I noticed that whenever he shifted position, at least two of them would adjust their own positions to maintain what was probably a tactical advantage, and the level of coordinated awareness suggested communication methods I was not detecting. I asked the silver-backed leader about their social structure and their territory, and how they had remained hidden for so long, despite increasing human presence in these mountains. And the answers came from multiple individuals contributing pieces of information that built into a comprehensive picture. They described a network of family groups that maintained loose contact across vast territories, methods of communication that involved structured vocalizations that could carry for miles through the forest, and an acute awareness of human patterns and behaviors that allowed them to avoid contact when they chose to do so. The concept that they chose to remain hidden rather than being simply elusive due to low population numbers was significant, and I asked directly whether there had been times when they could have revealed themselves but had decided against it. The response involved what I interpreted as something close to humor, a sound that was almost like laughter, and the leader told me about humans who had come so close to seeing them that they could have reached out and touched them, but who had been looking at their phones or talking loudly to each other and had missed what was standing just off the trail, watching them pass. Could human obliviousness explain why they had survived so long, or was it more than chance? I wanted to know about their ethics and their understanding of right and wrong, whether they had concepts that paralleled human morality, or whether their social rules operated on entirely different principles, and this question seemed to interest them because multiple individuals contributed to the answer in what became almost a philosophical discussion. They spoke about balance and about respecting the boundaries of other beings, about taking only what was needed, and about the consequences that came to those who violated the agreements that held their society together. It was during this discussion that the tone shifted noticeably, because the leader made a direct reference to watching and judging and understanding the difference between those who came to the forest with respect and those who came with greed or the intention to exploit what they found. Its eyes moved deliberately to where Torin was standing at the clearing's edge, and the statement it made next was unambiguous in its implication that not all humans present were considered equally trustworthy or safe. I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly what it meant, and I knew that Torin's barely concealed calculation and his comments about footage value and funding opportunities had not gone unnoticed. And I tried to explain that humans varied greatly in their intentions and their respect for boundaries, just as I assumed they did in their own communities. The leader acknowledged this with a gesture that suggested agreement, but made it clear that acknowledgement of variation did not mean tolerance for those who demonstrated harmful intent, and I felt the weight of that statement settle over the clearing like a physical presence. Could I prevent a tragic outcome if Torin ignored their warning? Torin chose that moment to speak up for the first time in nearly an hour, his voice carrying an edge of frustration as he said something about needing better close-up footage and about how we should be documenting this more thoroughly for maximum impact, and every single creature in the clearing went completely still in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I found myself speaking quickly to try to redirect attention away from what had just been said, explaining that different humans had different priorities, and that not everyone understood the ethics of this situation the way I was beginning to. The leader made a sound that was clearly directed at Torin rather than at me, and the words that came out were simple but carried unmistakable meaning about boundaries and respect and the consequences of ignoring warnings. Torin responded with something dismissive about not being threatened by animals, no matter how well they could mimic human speech, and I felt everything in my chest go cold and tight because I knew he had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. What happened next unfolded with a terrible deliberateness, a structured act rooted in their culture. The largest creature stood before Torin, while two others gripped his shoulders and arms, preventing him from pulling away. The silver-backed leader began ritual vocalizations, joined by the others in harmonics that made my bones vibrate and tears blur my vision. I realized I was witnessing a ceremony that doubled as execution. Torin screamed, his face contorted with terror and disbelief, but the chorus absorbed his cries. The leader pressed on his chest, the pattern of vocalization shifting into something mournful, yet certain. I could not look away, bearing witness the only way to honor him. His ribs began to compress under the inexorable force, and his screams morphed into something animal. When his ribs finally cracked, the sickening sound carried over the chanting. The leader twisted Torin's neck with a single motion, silencing him. The ritual concluded. The creatures lowered his body gently, then stepped back, forming a perimeter around the clearing. Would their judgment extend to me, or had I proven myself safe? I had recorded everything on the GoPro, from the ritual's beginning to Torin's final breath. The leader acknowledged the camera, then spoke calmly about choice, consequence, and the enforcement of boundaries. Torin's death was not murder, but the result of his refusal to respect their rules. I told it I understood and would honor their trust. I walked into the forest, the creature's vocalizations fading behind me. The hike back took all night, navigating difficult terrain while processing trauma and grief. I also knew I had been given something rare, a bridge between human understanding and an intelligence that had chosen to reveal itself. And I would carry that truth forward, fully and clearly.